Coming live from Mexico City, the capital of Mexico, is our guest tonight. Welcome to this very special edition of the KJ Masterclass Live, the show which ensures that you profit from your time spent here with experts either through their industry insights, information, or simply learning from them. And before I move forward, may I request you to subscribe, follow, like, and comment on whichever platform you're watching or listening to this show on. And today we have Michael Meurer, founder of the Reimagining Politics educational project. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Hi, AJ. Thanks so much for having me on today.
Thank you so much, Michael, for joining us live from Mexico City and sharing your views. Let's reimagine politics together, and we'll be talking about so many things. You have been studying citizen-driven political innovation in Europe and the Americas since 2017, while teaching university seminars and leading political roundtable analysts. Events. You are also a political analyst. You are also a writer, and we'll be talking about a permanent sense of crisis is eroding democracies across the world. So we will talk about this subject largely, but can you tell us what exactly is this reimagining politics and that to an educational project? Over to you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, for many years, I've been a political analyst, writer, and consultant in the U.S., and I was a co-founder. I was at one point a senior advisor to the California Democratic Party, which is the largest Democratic Party in the U.S., state Democratic Party. And I was co-founder of something called the Courage Campaign, which today I think has 1.7 million members. And I co-founded that with a friend, and we built it up to, I don't know, a 300, we had like a $1.2 million budget when I left and about 300,000 members. And the idea was to empower grassroots initiatives that were citizen driven. So it was a great experience. And, and then I did political consulting and analysis for many years and realized that being in the belly of the beast, the system just didn't work. There's a young political consultant in the U.S. named Walker Bragman, a political writer, and Walker says that representative democracy is neither. It's neither representative nor is it democratic. It's run by high dollar donors, basically. So it's a bought and paid for system. And, the key is to unlock citizen driven innovation. And that's what I went in search of. In 2016 in the US, we had Trump versus Hillary. And it was so clear to me, I already knew from years of experience that the system was broken. It didn't work. It was controlled completely by donors, large donors mainly. And this was the clearest, most glaring sign I'd ever seen. And I left the country. I started traveling, just looking for citizen-driven innovation, looking for projects that people had started outside of parties and for the most part, outside of government. And I started in Europe. I actually started in Paris. I visited a friend there who was a professor of architecture and urban design. And I honestly did not expect to find very much. It was an experiment. But what I started finding blew me away. There was just incredibly creative citizen-driven innovation everywhere I traveled. We'll get into that. I'll talk about some of the models I discovered. And, the mission became to showcase this innovation, to showcase these citizen-driven initiatives. What do you do when you can't get your problem solved through the traditional political system, through parties, through government, and so forth? Or when you have a crisis in your community and you have to solve it yourself. And that's where you see real political innovation emerge. And the idea is just to show those models. And I had a few criteria for them. As I started to encounter these projects, I wanted them to be duplicable, that you could duplicate the project in another environment. I wanted them to be scalable so they could grow. And I wanted them to be transferable across borders. So those three criteria. And I found all kinds of things. I could talk endlessly about specific examples if you want to get into that, but That's how the project started.
Right.
And,
Right. Right. Michael, carry on. Carry on.
and well, and then, the pandemic hit, and politics pretty much everywhere shut down. And, that had my thinking had to shift just like everybody else was thinking. Like, what does politics even mean now? Uh, and, I realized immediately that the pandemic was being used to redistribute money. Always follow the money. It's about the pandemic is, yes, it's about a virus, but it's primarily about the redistribution of money and power upward. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, I wrote a 6-part series of articles called COVIDnomics, uh, so tracing the money and looking at what was happening just before a global pandemic was declared. And what was happening was that there was the largest debt versus debt versus global gross domestic product. So total global productivity versus total global debt. There was 323% more debt than productivity, global GDP, the highest in human history. And the IMF issued a report just before the pandemic and said, they were basically said all the lights on the global dashboard are blinking red. If we can't, we have to flood the system with liquidity. If we can't do something to alleviate this $48 trillion in uncoverable debt in the corporate and financial sectors, we're going to have what they called GDP freeze. No, GDP lockup, basically. The whole system would freeze up. So it needed liquidity, number one. The financial system was broken, the economic system. And then on the other hand, you had the Verisk Maplecroft, the largest political consultancy in the world. Again, at the very beginning of 2020, before a global pandemic was declared, they issued a report saying that political instability and volatility was the highest they'd ever seen it since they started doing annual studies about political volatility. And they predicted political volatility, I think, in 110 countries in 2021 and 2022 for the next decade. They thought it would be a decade of absolute political chaos. Well, with the declaration of a global pandemic, suddenly the system was flooded with liquidity, mainly from the US, although quite a bit from the EU as well. But the US, within the first 5 months, Time magazine reported the total stimulus was $20 trillion. At the same time, active political life was just shut down. Stay in your house, 6 feet apart, wear a mask. And, the twin effects of this economic shutdown and political shutdown were profound. Behind the scenes, all this money was flowing into the speculative financial sector, basically, and corporations that had taken incredibly risky bets and were, overwhelmed with debt. And we basically paid for that out of the public treasury. So the U.S. now has the highest the highest public debt since 1946. It's at $30 trillion. And, we had an election in 2020 that was 100% virtual, no in-person politics. It's a profound change. Frankly, I'm still analyzing it. And it's to the point now where these, I'm going to say, hundreds of initiatives that I found when I was traveling the world investigating citizens' political innovation, I don't even know the status of most of them. I've got to reimagine the project of reimagining politics and go back and revisit these initiatives and see what they're doing, how they've responded to the pandemic. And, I've shifted my focus during the pandemic to writing.
Right.
A kind of it's political, but it's more from a philosophical point of view. Like, we have to rethink how we govern ourselves. Go back to fundamentals, go back to the whiteboard, as they say, in brainstorming sessions. So, I'm rethinking the project, frankly. We did, just before the pandemic, we did a big seminar at the National University of Mexico, which was a big success. A lot of these kids in the class, young people, are being told that the world's coming to an end. The seas are rising, everything's going to flood, and we're all going to die in 10 minutes or 10 years, whatever the time frame du jour is. And it's debilitating for them. And we told them just the opposite. We said, it isn't going to end. And
Right.
you're going to have to solve the problem. You're the future. And, we're not here to lecture you or teach you anything really from our personal experience. We're here to show you what other people are doing in terms of citizen-driven innovation all over the world. And they loved, and we have absolute confidence in you to do something brilliant with this information, with these models. And I think that's the way you proceed. I think it's showing people what's working, showing people what people just like them are doing in other places, and seeding that sort of political creativity and innovation.
Right, Michael. Right. You see, it's such an important way I see the discussion that we are having today. You belong to the world's uh, biggest democracy, and then you move on to another country in 2016, and you are watching right now. You're not in in Mexico City. I am at the moment in the world's largest democracy, and we are trying to reimagine politics. You have seen politics from very close, and when you see things from very close, you actually see things in their real form. Politics has always been about, you know, about power also. And
Yes.
when sometimes it just and people are also a part of it, but several times it shifts towards just power, and that's the unfortunate part of it. And then that's why the whole thing called power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's how it comes. And then there are so many stakeholders that emerge out of so many places who want a stake in that power. Then that's where that whole corruption of system starts getting built up, and people become only incidental to this whole state of affairs. And I guess that's the way a lot many places are developing. That's the way things are happening. But you have also found the silver lining that a lot of non-government activities are happening, and they are doing some great stuff. But first, from the political point itself, why do you call that representative democracies today are neither representative nor democratic in several places, and that there is a permanent sense of crisis that is eroding democracy? Can you help us understand this part a bit?
Well, I mean, when you have a crisis, power tends to flow upward. It's a mechanism for consolidating political and economic power, and I think that's very clear. What has happened during this pandemic, and they've now linked it, through the World Economic Forum and their Great Reset and so forth. I don't know if you're familiar with that idea, but they've linked climate change. We need to build back better. We need to have a great reset of the entire capitalist system, and that's the only way we're going to get out of this current crisis of pandemic and war and climate disaster. And so, you have to step back and say, is the crisis really as severe as they're saying? And are the solutions they're proposing the right solutions? And I think the answer in both cases is no. You when you it's very tempting when you have power to exaggerate the sense of crisis, because it allows you to accumulate more power, and it always flows upward. It doesn't flow downward. So honestly, I don't know how we get out of this current mess, but I think it's unsustainable. I mean, you see, another thing that's happening is the emergence of a kind of transnational governing structure. This has been happening for a very long time. You may remember some years ago, like 10 years ago or so, Uruguay, the country of Uruguay instituted some very strict labeling requirements for cigarettes. And they were sued by Philip Morris, the tobacco company. Well, how can that even happen? Uruguay is a sovereign nation. They can implement any law they want. But it turns out that there's all these transnational tribunals, many of them controlled by the World Bank. And when there's a dispute between countries and also between global corporations and countries, a country can be sued and through one of these World Bank tribunals, and that's exactly what happened. Philip Morris moved their headquarters to Switzerland some years ago to evade liability, and Switzerland happened to have some sort of free trade agreement with Uruguay, and Philip Morris said, well, these packaging requirements showing people with their teeth rotting out and cancerous tumors and so forth, they were really lurid, and smoking started to drop, especially among young people. It wasn't cool and sexy anymore in Uruguay, and so Philip Morris became alarmed. They had a little factory there. They shut it down just to punish Uruguay. Uruguay hired all the employees as health inspectors. It was an amusing story, but an important one, because it showed how easily this transnational power structure that's emerged could be used to attack a sovereign nation. Uruguay ultimately won. It was kind of a miracle, actually. But what we're seeing during this pandemic is the emergence of this transnational structure in a very powerful form, the World Economic Forum. And they're closely aligned with they work closely with the United Nations. There's 30 or 40 global organizations that have, including the WHO, for example, have played a prominent role in the response to the COVID pandemic. And they've made a concerted effort to link it to climate change. Right. That we have to build back better. We have to have a great reset. And that whole agenda to me is anti-democratic.
Right, Michael. Now, you see, wasn't it always that politics, economy, and business, they were always, very closely associated. They needed one another in one form or the other. That's the way. But when there is a positive cohesion, it leads to the benefit of people. When it goes in a different direction, when everybody starts cozying up, and when it distances away from the people, then there is a problem. Now, even the countries that you traveled, they had their own share of problems. They still have earlier on, and they will continue. That's the nature of power structures, the way human beings, and that's the way people want to live. Some people want to live in a much more different system. You may call it a communist system. Some people want to live in a much more people-oriented system. You can call it democratic system. It can be free market. In India, we started after independence. We had a mixed economy. We had government organizations, government companies, and then you had private organizations also. So that's the way everybody decides. As sovereign nations, everybody has a freedom to choose the path that they want to take. Now, in today's time, when you look at the things as today, do you think it will change after COVID? COVID is almost on its way out. There is the talk of monkeypox and several other, different viruses. I don't even know how to pronounce them. But
Marburg virus, for example.
Right. So what about after that? Will it be a pre-2000 COVID situation and the world will be back to a better place? Or is it that we have made a dynamic shift? And where is it moving? Where are we moving towards as humanity?
Oh, that's such a difficult, profound question. I think we're all asking it to ourselves. And I won't pretend to have an answer to that. I don't think anybody does. I mean, I can speculate like other people. I could make an educated analysis, and I actually did that. I wrote a pair of articles, excuse me, as part of my COVIDnomics series. I called it COVIDnomics, and I wrote 6 articles analyzing the political and financial activities, the shift in power and money upwards. But the last 2 articles in that series were asking the question, how does revolutionary change happen? Because at some point, if the consolidation of power becomes too onerous, it literally becomes authoritarian. And there's been a lot written about the authoritarian nature of the new regime that has emerged under COVID. I mean, you see it everywhere. You see the truckers protest in Canada, the farmers protest, both in the US and the Netherlands. The Wikipedia now has a page tracking the protests. They don't get a lot of media coverage, but they're going on all the time. People have had their livelihoods destroyed. They've been forced into taking vaccinations they don't want, and now we find out the vaccines don't work, and on and on and on. So, I wrote this 2-part series of articles called The Present Age, parts 1 and parts 2, asking how does revolutionary change emerge, and what do revolutionary leaders look like? Where do they come from? And it's not an easy question to answer. You have to look at historical precedents. And one of the historical precedents I looked at, one of the first ones, was the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Well, how did that happen? It was a monolithic structure. It dictated almost every aspect of daily life to people. And over a 25 or 30-year period, you had this underground resistance emerge. And they were not able to force change. You can't force change. I relied very heavily in these 2 articles on Hannah Arendt's analysis of revolution. How does revolutionary change occur? And she said that revolutionaries don't create revolutions. She said they hurry home to take advantage of the collapse of a regime. And that the way revolutionary change, whatever form that takes, driven by the people, how do the people get power back when it gets so far out of balance they have to act? They can't do anything until the existing regime has just lost credibility. It can't enforce its own mandates anymore because there's just a complete utter loss of public belief. They have no credibility at all. And then, if somebody hasn't been thinking ahead about what the new structure might look like, then you have a real problem. You have a vacuum of leadership. You have absolute chaos. You have anarchy. So I think it's important to stay engaged, to stay involved, to keep trying to be innovative politically, to organize with like-minded people, and to be ready for when what Hannah Arendt calls a revolutionary moment. When a revolutionary moment emerges, you cannot take advantage of it without a well-organized resistance that has, solid leadership, has thought through what the changes to the current structure need to be, and has an actual plan. Well, those plans differ a lot. I mean, look at what happened in Eastern Europe. You had Václav Havel was imprisoned when the Berlin Wall fell, the Iron Curtain, so to speak, fell, and like a month or 2 months later, he was out of prison and he was president. That's how fast things can change. But that rapid change was preceded by decades of political organizing and political philosophy, thinking, doing the hard work of thinking what the new structure might look like, that kind of flew under the radar. This declaration that they signed, the resistance movement in Hungary, I believe it was, in the 1970s, was only signed by 228 people. And it turned out to be one of the most important documents in the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, it doesn't have to be a lot of people. It has to be a group with powerful ideas that appeal to a lot of people. And so I don't know if that's going on today. I hope so.
Okay. Okay. So let's put it instead of humanity, let's put it to people in different countries. What do they seek from their leadership? Obviously, better lives from themselves. But you see, uh, when we when you have leaders like the ones that you got dejected with, or the way the system was turning from something different than you thought it was, then is it that people are looking for only that sort of leadership? Is it that the taste of people or the aspirations of people have changed, and it is a lack of people's good desire? You wish what you wish is what the universe gives. So is it that fault of a leadership, or is it the wrong sort of a desire of the people as a whole? How do you look at that?
Uh, well, again, you're asking incredibly, almost impossible to answer questions. But I do
Politics
think,
is the art of possible, of the
yeah.
possible.
Well, I taught a university seminar in Medellin, Colombia, a few years ago, and it was all upper division political science and international relations students. And I started by asking them, well, we're all here to, it was a class on the US political system and US campaigns. I said, so we're going to talk about politics for this whole week. And I think we should start by defining what politics is. And none of them could answer it. They really hadn't even thought about it. They were upper division students studying politics and international relations. Well, it turns out the definition, I gave them several definitions. I said, here, Aristotle says it's a science, and it's the most important science, because if we don't get it right, things are going to go to hell. And, it's more important than physics even. We have to learn how to
Sorry
conduct.
to interrupt, but I guess it has been turned into less of science and more of data science. The more data you have, the more you can influence people's choices, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Even the idea of politics as a science has been corrupted, or power has been consolidated with a small group. Yeah, absolutely. But the students didn't like that scientific definition of politics at all. They like Bismarck, as you referenced, politics is the art of the possible. And I said, but there was a second part to that statement by Bismarck. He said, you're never going to like what's possible, because it's really ugly. It's making
Right,
sausages. And no, if you like to eat sausage, you don't want to see how they're made. It's horrible. So,
right.
so we settled on a Bismarckian kind of definition of politics and went on with the class. But I found it interesting that what they really liked, because think about Bismarck and the art of the possible. It sounds an awful lot like Donald Trump and the art of the deal. Because
Right.
Bismarck wasn't guided by any particular strong ethical or moral beliefs. He wasn't going to drive a stake in the ground and fight to the death. He'd just change his mind or negotiate from a different angle. He just wanted to preserve the empire and make it grow. And that's a very transactional view of politics. And I think that leads to a consumerist view of politics. Well, if we just pick this new product or vote for this new candidate, they promise they're going to change well, they're not. So there's been a kind of infantilization that has happened all over the world, I think, in terms of political maturity. We've been turned into political consumers. It's especially pronounced in the United States. I mean, we have these gigantic, I don't know the exact price of the last election, but there's a website called Open Secrets that tracks the money, and it was about $14.5 billion in 2020, and another $1 billion minimum in quote, dark money that's untraceable. So $15.5 billion for a virtual election spectacle. You had, Trump on one hand, and he's basically an uber adolescent. And then you had, lacking impulse control. And then you had Biden on the other hand, who's cognitively impaired. I mean, had two brain aneurysms, as a kind of faux father figure. And that's the kind of political life that emerges from a society where, for decades, not just a few years, people have slowly given up their political agency to parties and media, global media, and so
Right.
forth. And so when I started Reimagining Politics, I was trying to find innovation that was happening at a much more granular level, and innovation that had the potential to scale upward in size and across borders. It had to be transferable and scalable and duplicable. And I found a lot of it before the pandemic, but now it's anybody's guess. Seriously, I would have to travel all over the world again, uh, doing the kind of investigation I did for 3 years before the pandemic.
Right, Michael. But you see, the good part is that your travels have yielded you positive results, and you have found something to look forward to. And it's a find that's what that you are sharing with the world today through this podcast and through the writings that you are doing on Substack, on other platforms that you are doing now. If you can share with us, how exactly, what are kind of new political models you discovered during your travels, your research, and which civic projects that you have encountered stand out as having the most potential for being duplicated and scaled across borders, because that's the silver lining I can see. And once we talk about this, then we'll go back to the political systems again.
Okay. Sure. Well, one of the most interesting and I thought impactful projects that I encountered was an initiative it started in Madrid, Spain, called, now bear in mind, I didn't travel to India or China, obviously the two biggest countries in the world with fascinating histories and really interesting political systems. So I'm talking about Europe and the Americas. That's where I traveled. This is what I found there. But I think these projects could be duplicated even in India, probably. You would know
Right.
better than I. But this project was called Vivero de Iniciativas Ciudadanas, which means nursery of citizens' initiatives. And that's exactly what it was. It was a kind of nursery for citizens' initiatives. And it emerged from the Atocha train station bombings. And I don't remember what year that happened, but it's 2012 or 2018 or something. I don't remember the exact year. But there were two. There was the Atocha train station bombing and one other that killed hundreds of people. It was the worst terrorist incident in Spanish history. Well, the government, declared 30 days of mourning, and then they said, we have to build a memorial to the victims of these tragic bombings, and it has to be open to public bidding. And so they said, okay, we want a memorial that honors all these 158 or whatever the number of victims was. And we're putting it out for open bid. And a group of students at the National University, they were studying, urban design and urban innovation and politics, and some of them architecture. They got together and said, look, this is an open bidding process. Let's form a company and make a bid. And so they were very creative. They created a design for the memorial and submitted a bid, and they won. Well, they never built anything in their lives. So now they have to build this monument. And it was a very spectacular thing. It was like 80 feet round. It was a glass cylinder and it had a glass brick floor with lights coming up from underneath. And in the overhead, there was this, entire thing was a screen, and the names of all the victims and comments from their friends were swirling in the overhead that you could see when you were standing inside this illuminated cylinder. It was almost dark except for the illumination coming from underneath and from the screen. And they got the names from having people sign up at all the train stations around Madrid, saying, we're really going to miss you, Jose. It was so much fun working on the community gardening project with you, or the bicycle transportation project, or the helping elderly shut-ins project, or whatever. And so what they began to find, just collecting these names and these testaments, these memorials to the victims, they said, look, they're all involved in political stuff at a really micro level that flies way under the radar. And so they started mapping these initiatives. And that led to a project called Civics. And I don't remember what the Civics acronym stands for, but it's basically there are interactive maps online now. It's all open source, it's all Creative Commons, showing these initiatives. And there were hundreds and hundreds, thousands of them. They eventually got a 2.7 million euro grant from the Spanish government, and they mapped the civic initiatives in every city in Spain, put them in this online mapping system, which I can send you a link to after the show. And then they said, wow, this is great. Let's start doing this in other Spanish-speaking countries. And they came to Mexico. They mapped about 1,200 projects in Mexico City, about 600 in Guadalajara. They've been in 6 or 7 other countries. Before the pandemic, I don't know what they're doing now, but I thought, wow, what a beautiful model, because you could duplicate this anywhere. And suddenly, all these little initiatives that didn't know about one another can go on this online open source map, add their own initiative, or change what's already on. Like they've got new members or a new program, they can add it to the open source map, and everybody can see one another and they can connect in entirely new ways. So I thought that's a brilliant model. That's a model we can duplicate. On the complete other end of the spectrum, no technology, nothing. I was in Santiago de Chile in 2017, I think it was, to meet with the university about teaching a seminar. So we had a big long meeting, and they said, would you like to go to happy hour with a bunch of the professors and talk more politics and more reimagining? And I was just starting Reimagining Politics at that point. And so we went for drinks, and one of the women sitting next to me was married to one of the professors. Her name was Javiera. And I said, it was an interesting discussion all around, but Javiera wasn't saying much. And I said, Javiera, what do you do? And she said, I run a project started by the Bachelet government, Michelle Bachelet. So it's actually started as a government project. It's moved beyond that now. So I run a project called Quiero mi barrio, which is in Spanish means I love my neighborhood. And I said, well, what a beautiful name. What do you do exactly? And she said, well, very little. We go into the communities that are at risk, and the first thing we ask them is, do you love your neighborhood? We show them attention. We give them love, basically. Do you love your neighborhood? Even in the worst barrios, they say yes. We love it, but it's a mess. Es un gran quilombo. What do we do? And they connect them to other organizations. They come in and help them with paint and signage and education. And this has swept across the Andes. It's got a big website with dozens of examples of Quiero mi barrio projects. Well, that's a great little project. Doesn't cost a lot of money. It can be duplicated pretty easily, almost anywhere, and it doesn't cost a lot. And it's high impact. People are thrilled to have this attention, and they're they have many success stories of people turning their neighborhoods around, building little pocket parks and that kind of thing, building bike paths, helping older folks in after school programs, and on and on. It's reclaiming their neighborhood. Somebody showed them some love and attention, gave them a few resources, and connected them to other people. So, the common thread in both of those stories is connection. Getting connected to people who want change as well. Well, those kinds of initiatives were everywhere that I traveled before the pandemic. I mean, I could go on and on and on. There were a lot of them. And once you start meeting these people, they introduce you to other people, and you find that it's pretty easy to discover these kinds of projects. My guess would be there's probably a lot of this kind of innovation in India, or there was certainly before the pandemic. But it flies under the radar. It's not It's not high visibility stuff. I, after I discovered all these initiatives, I said, what do we do with these? How do these tie together for some sort of more meaningful, overarching change, sort of global change? And I discovered this brilliant professor at Yale. Her name is Helene Landemore, and she's written a couple of books on just basically, she's reimagining politics in a slightly different way. She is saying that, kind of what Walker Bragman is saying, representative democracy is neither representative nor democratic anymore. And that, the key is making sure that citizens are engaged in their own civic life, that they take their civic responsibility seriously, and that they demand real political agency, where they have real input and real impact in their own communities. And so she proposed a model in which political service, civic duty, was obligatory. It wasn't optional. It was either through a kind of national draft or lottery, or like conscription for the army or something like that. So everybody had to serve. Their time was limited, and at some point, this circulates throughout society. And I thought, wow, this is a really interesting idea. It's at a very high theoretical level. There aren't that I know of. There aren't active, successful models of this kind of political conscription, let's call it, obligatory civic duty. But it's an intriguing concept, and it would be certainly a way to tie in these micro initiatives that I kept finding everywhere I traveled, to give them a more overarching meaning. Like, how do we implement Quiero mi barrio in our neighborhood? Well, you've got 2 years of obligatory civic duty. Here's all these models. Take your pick. Start making change.
That's the positive part. Citizens can vote a different type of leadership, and the same citizens can come out with different models, different things that are very much workable and much more better than what projects, what the way government would ever want to do. But in some of the projects here, you can say government is also a participant. So it's always, let's try to look at the brighter side. But one thing has always intrigued me, Michael, is that, in India, we have hundreds of political parties, and we have got so many parties even on regional level in our states. But in the US, the largest democracy, the biggest democracy in the world, why they have stuck to only the two-party system? Maybe a couple of here and there, some small parties are there and all, but they're not so prominent to leave such a strong impact. Why has it always been like that? Means if there's more challenge, much more heterogeneity, then perhaps it will lead to much more diverse sort of people coming into politics, who will have perhaps not so much of money power.
That's another really interesting question, because in the U.S., many of us now talk about the idea that we have a uniparty. We have a Democratic and a Republican brand, but they're the same brand. I mean, there are minor changes, and sometimes those minor changes have an important impact on daily, domestic life. But for the most part, it's a uniparty. If when the U.S. said the Ukraine war is our war, and we're going to send we've sent $54 billion in arms and aid to Ukraine since the Russian invasion, which a lot of very smart people think we provoked, and I happen to agree with that. I think it was totally avoidable, but that's had universal, one or two senators, one or two Congress people, just a handful, opposed it. It's basically one party. On the really big issues, they're very much in sync, and they've consolidated power, and it's very difficult to get it away from them. And at the same time that has happened over the last 100 years in the United States, there's been a a kind of erosion of civil association, not overtly political stuff, but when de Tocqueville toured the United States back in the 1800s, the thing that he was most struck by, he said it was the key to U.S. democracy, was this incredible proliferation of civic associations, not political parties, not civic associations, civil associations. And they existed everywhere. I mean, hundreds of thousands of them. And when a community wanted to build a hospital or build a new road or dig a new canal or whatever, they did it locally. They did it through civil associations. And some were bigger than others, obviously, but there was a enormous multiplicity of civil associations. And that was you had to work with people in order to get these community projects done. And that was where real political training came. That's where citizens became real citizens. They learned to work with people they didn't get along with or didn't even like necessarily for the greater good of the community. It was a really good training ground. We had a different type of political leader emerge from that, that civil society that used to exist. And that's gone. There's a very famous book written 3 or 4 decades ago now, I think 3 decades ago, by a Harvard professor named Robert Putnam. And the title of the book, to give you an idea how old it is, was called Bowling Alone. And we're no longer bowling in teams. He traced in detail this erosion, this disappearance of civil association as the country got bigger and the wars got bigger and the projects got bigger and the corporations got bigger. Power started to get consolidated at the top. People, ceded that power slowly over time. And, these civil associations began to disappear. There's a MIT professor named Sherry Turkle who's sort of revisited parts of Putnam's analysis, and she says, she calls it, we're together alone. We're connected by social media, but we're in our little silos. And so, we don't have the connective tissue of the kind of civil society that in the US anymore that you're talking about in India. And I don't know a lot about India's political system. It's fascinating to me because Modi is the most popular political leader, prime minister, or president in the world right now. I mean, it's 70% approval. And Mexico's president, AMLO, is second. He's a 65% approval, give or take a percentage point. And so it's really interesting to me because Modi is kind of a conservative, grassroots, conservative populist, I'd call him. And AMLO here in Mexico is a sort of left-leaning populist. Very different political ideologies, but they're both super popular. And I think the reason is they both have kind of stuck to their guns. They have been consistent with their messaging, and it's directed towards the people. I don't know how different they both are in actual practice. I don't know how much has really changed. But
Narendra Modi, he's the prime minister of our country, and he's actually, not conservative in thinking. He's very advanced. He's much for, digitalization of everything, cashless society, and everything that is modern. He has launched a great incentive in terms of Ayushman Bharat. That's in terms of healthcare and all. So you see, India is a huge country, and everybody can look at things from their own different ways. Then, as I said, regional politics is also very strong here. Regional parties are very strong here, and in many places, regional parties are into power. They have their own chief minister. So, but the good part is that all views get represented in the in every corner of the country. We have our problems, as I said. We'll be overtaking China very soon in terms of population, but
Yep.
but there is a lot of things that we can look forward to. We are moving forward, that's for sure. And 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 let's now move forward towards your book, Michael. 3 new books in 2023. Tell us about that.
Well, I hope. I'm way behind schedule. But the first book, it's really based on my travel and experience. Two of the books are, and the third book is more like political philosophy. So the first book is called Pachamama Tales, and it goes back to when I first started traveling. Because before I started reimagining politics, several years before, I spent a year in Argentina and the Southern Cone making short films, and it was a form of political investigation, asking a simple question to people: uh, what is America? Because it's more than just the United States, and it has a fascinating history of all of the Americas. It's America, and it has a fascinating history and a unique position and impact in human history. So I thought just finding people giving unique answers to that simple question, whether it's through politics or art or whatever. So I had this project called Pan American Dreams, and looking back on it, it's pretty much written already. It's a series of tales, of stories about the people I encountered, the amazing history of the Americas, the cauldron of political activity that was going on in the nations of the Americas where I traveled at the time. And it's a sort of political adventure story, because it was, I traveled by every means of transport known to man, had all kinds of catastrophes and disaster. We were stuck in the middle of a desert, it's called the Puna, in the heart of the Andes. It sprawls across four nations. Our truck broke an axle there. We were going to film a political project in the center of that desert. So, the first book is about that set of experiences. It lasted about a year, and really longer, because I kept going back and I've stayed in touch with so many of the people, and they're very politically active. They made it into the Reimagining Politics project as well, because they've done so much political innovation. And then the second book is my travels since leaving the U.S. in 2016. And I still am a U.S. citizen. I go back regularly, but I've traveled through, I think, 24 cities and 14 or 15 countries since leaving in 2016 and traveling. And it's about both the personal stories and the political stories. What did I encounter politically? A lot of what you and I have just been talking about earlier. And then, the things that just happen to you: being stuck in an earthquake, having medical disasters, being stuck in a pandemic in another country. And so I call it a new form of writing. I call it, it's a fusion of fiction and fact. I call it friction, because sometimes you have to fictionalize people's names or the circumstances, and so it's, the core elements are absolutely true. But that's what those two books are about. One is called Pachamama Tales, and Pachamama means Mother Earth in the Quechua, the early American cultures. And so Pachamama Tales, and then From Shamans to Scientists is the name of the second book. And it's, all about all these crazy experiences with shamans, with, profound spiritual insight, to, crazy political adventures and finding amazing projects, and, falling in love, falling out of love, just meeting amazing people who are doing amazing things. So I call the kind of political adventure stories slightly fictionalized. So political friction, let's just call it that. Then the third book is more of a philosophical work. It's called I Feudalism and the Theology of Capital. And it's, that's the most difficult to write. I've maybe got 70 or 80 pages written. It takes an enormous amount of research. You have to document very carefully what you're saying. And even then, I never feel qualified to write these things. It's just out of a need to explain it to yourself, because you don't see it being explained anywhere else. It's hard work. And when I started writing this book several years ago, I believe that capitalism had been transformed into a kind of quasi-religion, and the theology of capital, and that was really bad both economically and politically. And I think now that's fused with this messianic sense of mission over climate change. So the book has to be. I have to rethink the book. It's almost. I'm not starting over, but I've got to talk more about. This underlying philosophy has changed dramatically. Like earlier when we talked about the loss of this profusion, this incredible diversity, flowering of civil associations, we've also lost the flowering of economic models, of economic diversity. I think in India and also in Mexico, more of that still exists. And we may be looking at a future that isn't focused so much on the United States. I mean, I do think it's an empire in a state of decline without any question. It's still very powerful. It may last a very long time. You can't ignore it. It's heavily armed. So
That's the rule of nature, Michael. It does
yeah,
not take anything away from anybody, but it's just that it recalibrates everything.
yes,
Like US came into prominence after the Second World War.
yes,
Then now we talk more about China.
yes.
Then
In India,
the way, yes, and the way the world is moving, you can be the most powerful person in the world or the most wealthy businessman of the world. At the end of the day, it has to be humanity which has to survive. Or what will you do with all that power and all that money inside a cave with a lantern in your hand, nobody to
yes, yes,
talk to,
yeah,
and
yeah,
talking of power shifts, even continents shift. That's what we read in geography. If
yeah.
continents can shift, there is continental drift. What is power of a nation or a couple of nations in front of that? That's the rule of
Yeah, I mean, we're definitely in a period of transition and change,
and
and China can't be ignored. India can't be ignored, and there's something else, and I think Latin America can't be ignored. There's something else going on in Europe. The median age is about 45. I think it's even older in Germany. In the U.S., it's about 35. It's about the same in China. I don't know what it is in India. Maybe you can tell me. But
we are at the moment we have the most number of working people in our population, so we have that demographic advantage at the moment.
yeah,
But having
you're
yeah
younger, and Latin America is younger. In Mexico, the average age is 28, and it's 28 almost across Latin America.
right.
So, that creates a different kind of political thinking. It's very future oriented.
Right, right. What one thing I can tell you as we end the show, Michael, is that whatever it is, whatever systems that human beings will be, or you try to bring them under, at the end of the day, if humans are not at the center of it all, it will shift the whole focus of everything. And
Yes,
Mars is still far, far away.
yes, I absolutely agree with that. It has to, there has to be a kind of humanism, a human-centered core to your politics, or you'll end up with authoritarianism or dictatorship or something worse. So, I regarding the decline of the U.S. empire, I just published this morning. I saw this. I published a new article called "The United States of Elvis," because I saw this new Elvis biopic a couple of weeks ago. I've been thinking about it ever since. It's a very flashy, gaudy, Technicolor, kaleidoscopic kind of movie, and but he's covering a period in U.S. history which I think has sort of been forgotten about. It's the period of the 50s and 60s when the big global power emerged, and I kind of see the Elvis thing, and Lehrman, the director, the Australian director, tries to tie Elvis's life to the politics of the day very closely, even though he wasn't a very political guy at all. He was focused on his stardom and his wealth and so forth and pleasure. But the the decline, his decline, I almost see it as a kind of foreshadowing where the U.S. is headed. You know, he died basically, it was suicide. They found 12 lethal prescription drugs in his system and massive overdoses. It was a heart attack caused by that, really. And, you know, in the U.S. as a country, we now have this fentanyl and meth epidemic that, you know, has killed 1 million people in the last 20 years. And it's an interesting parallel to explore.
I see US as people there. I don't see government here and there. They keep on changing. Ultimately, it's the people. Anywhere else, also in any political system, it's all about people, and may the people win. That's all
Yes.
I can say.
Yeah, I agree completely.
May
It's
the
always
people
about
of
the
the
people.
world, may the
Absolutely.
people of the world win. May humanity always win.
Yes.
With this, it's a wrap on this edition of the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much, Michael, for joining in. We will keep on talking, and I will always keep on looking at new articles on Substack and those 3 books that are due very soon. Thank
Okay.
you once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. It was a wonderful interview.